in some, in some well-defined sense, that Africans achieved what they were trying to achieve. They were trying to keep the scale of society small. They were trying to stop the emergence of these big states controlling and bossing people around, and they did succeed. It's a bit like the Swiss in some sense. You always think like Switzerland is like the role model for Nigeria. The problem is it took the Swiss, 700 years to construct that, and the Nigerians don't have 700 years.
Welcome, James. Welcome to the UBS Center Food Supply. So you're a professor at the University of Chicago, you're an economist, a political scientist, an historian, and you spent a lot of your career working on Africa. And I mean, as probably everybody knows by now, you are one of the recent co-laureates of the Nobel Prize. But I think I learned that you recently added to your CV also that you are a chief in Eastern Nigeria. Is that right?
In Eastern Nigeria, yes, that's right.
And
yes.
So what's the story? What's about with that?
I've been working in Eastern Nigeria for 6 years now, and I've got to know a lot of the faculty at the University of Nigeria at Nsukka, so I work a lot with this historian called Chima Korie. And so I've been in his village many times, Umucheze, it's called, outside Owerri. And so they gave me this chieftaincy title. So I'm not going to have a go at it in Igbo, because Westerners are notoriously unable to pronounce Igbo properly. But the translation of the title into English is brother from a foreign land.
Fantastic.
So,
Fantastic.
Yes.
Yeah. And what are your duties as a chief, I guess?
My duties, well, you have to contribute to the community. I can participate in the Aladimna, which is like the local assembly, basically. So in the village, they have an assembly where they make kind of decisions, very participatory. So I can take part in the assembly, and I can even they have a chief's council, but you have to contribute. So I'm an honorary member of Chima's age group, for example. So you have to pay dues and you contribute to the community. That's how it works. Yeah.
Well, congratulations on these other achievements.
It was very thrilling. Yes.
And let's talk a bit more about chiefs. Of course, they are very important even today in many issues of economic development in Africa. Of course, they played a big role in the pre-colonial period, during the pre-colonial period, and now in the post-colonial phase. And they come up a lot in your book about the narrow corridor as an agent of balance or tension between state and civil society. So can you tell us a bit more about the role that chiefs play in Africa today and in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my view has evolved quite a lot on this topic. Like when I first started working in Sierra Leone in 2007, for example, I'd read this book by Mahmoud Mamdani called Citizen and Subject, where he sort of basically blames all of the problems of post-colonial Africa on these chiefs. His claim, especially in British Africa, is that the British governed indirectly through traditional rulers and traditional elites. And this created, what he calls this decentralized despotism. So I had that image in my mind when I started working in Sierra Leone. And the funny thing I organized all these focus groups. I went to focus group, and then you hear all of these people, expressing opinions about the chiefs and whatever, and people complain about the chiefs, and but then what I saw in that is that in many ways the chiefs were also regarded as sort of legitimate rulers, So that was very difficult to sort of square. And you see that in the Afrobarometer data, for example. People express extremely positive opinions across Africa with respect to traditional rulers. So I found that really difficult to actually get my head around that, because we sort of set off on this path of, thinking about the chieftaincy as a sort of basically a kind of colonial construction. But of course, when you talk to the chiefs, and we investigated, with Tristan Reed, the history of a lot of these chieftaincies, they all go back into the 19th century. So everyone tells a story of the history of the chieftaincy that goes back into the 19th century, even before, in some of them, into the 18th century. So they long antedated the colonial period, and many of their kind of powers, with respect to the allocation of land or dispute resolution also seemed very kind of traditional, so I got the impression, and I think this has been confirmed to me in lots of other contexts where I've worked in Africa, that actually there's more continuity at this local level than there is sort of rupture, in the colonial period. Like, any paramount chief in Sierra Leone or in Nigeria would be absolutely outraged at the idea that somehow the British had created this institution. Obviously, colonialism affected these institutions, but I think I've got more and more to appreciate the extent to which Africans were able to sort of preserve, in some sense, the institutions they valued at a local level through, the trials and tribulations of colonialism, or, at the end of the day, rural Sierra Leone was sort of governed by about 20 British, colonial officials who couldn't speak the language, who didn't really understand the institutions. And so then if you think about it like that, it's pretty hard to reorganize a society, with 20 administrators in some sense. So I think that's, and I guess I've come to appreciate much more, like, many of these institutions, they look very strange from a kind of Western perspective, the way these people are selected, they're not democratically elected, but nevertheless, they're legitimate in many contexts. So I think there's a sort of complicated trade-off here in the sense that many of these institutions, you could say, are, traditional, they have a lot of respect or legitimacy, but they're also not so well adapted, maybe, to economic change or economic progress. And, so I think there's a lot, so there's a trade-off there, I think, which I've been trying to think about more.
Now, interesting that you mentioned your work in Sierra Leone. I also remember when I was working there that, for instance, chiefs played a pretty big role in contract enforcement. So we were doing this research with Tristan, actually, we have this common co-author, on how traders expand credit to farmers for them to produce, to increase production and improve quality, for example. And one of the goals of this relationship is that by extending credit, traders can sort of lock in farmers and being guaranteed that then when harvest time comes, the farmers will sell to them, right? And one question is, how can credit be enforced in this setting? Because you could worry as a trader that you give money to a farmer and then the farmer sells to somebody else and the whole relationship breaks down. And it was clear working in different parts of the country that the local chiefs played a big role in ensuring that this type of relational contract would work. And so even in today's value chains, their role comes, as you said, comes as an authority, as something that can be used to leverage for economic gains. But then, of course, in your work, you find these important trade-offs between, let's say, social capital and economic productivity when it comes to the strength of the chiefdom, right? That was one of the big results in that paper, if I remember correctly.
I think that's right, but I think we didn't sort of conceptualize the more positive sides of things, in some sense. So I think, like, the difficult thing is to kind of characterize the whole equilibrium in the sense that the chiefs have power and authority, and maybe that has, some negative consequences in the way, in the productivity of agriculture, the way, land is allocated, like in the work that Marcus Goldstein and Chris Udry did in Ghana. I think very sort of similar in many ways, that setup. But the chiefs also play these positive role, and of course, even the way land is allocated plays positive role. The way, like in rural Sierra Leone, land is owned by kinship groups or extended families or descent groups. So you get access, if you're part of that group, you have a right to access the land, okay? But nobody has sort of private property rights in the land. But in some sense, that structure is designed to kind of keep the kinship group together. It's designed to preserve that institution which people value. Maybe it's valuable for all sorts of other reasons, like insurance, or maybe, who knows? Like, there's lots of, so I think, we looked at kind of one slice of this without conceptualizing very well these other things, these positives in some sense. So I think that's, so I think it's not that these economic losses, these economic issues are not there, they are, but you need to kind of conceptualize the positive things in order to have a better understanding of the equilibrium. And I think, the way I think about this now is, think about Britain, my own country, for example. 200 years ago, or 250 years ago, land was owned, collectively. It was owned by communities. There was common land. There was, and that was very inefficient economically. You had to coordinate. It inhibited technology adoption, all sorts of things. So how did that change? Well, the communities, the parishes themselves kind of reorganized property rights. So I think, Parliament created a mechanism whereby they reorganize their societies themselves. And I think that's a sort of good model in the sense that, it's up to the Sierra Leoneans, to sort of change this, to be better aware of the costs and the benefits. And then they have to choose to reorganize it. No, that seems to be the right way to think about it, rather than us telling them.
Yeah, I mean, this issue of land and land organization is really close to my heart and my interest today. This sort of autonomy and reorganization is probably not what's happening in vast areas of the continent. We are experiencing major transitions, maybe not necessarily in Sierra Leone, but for example in East Africa and in other regions, from even areas that are communal land are getting increase in freehold titles, Western-like property rights, and this is coming, for instance, with modernization of land systems, digital land registries, so much closer to the type of land administration that we have in this part of the world. But of course, this is creating major tensions in terms of who adjudicates, who gets the right, who is the new owner, and how does it conflict or not with the customary allocation. So it is very problematic. What is your view on these sort of patterns or more, let's say, heterodirect formalization?
Well, I don't know. If you looked at the history of Latin America, for example, if you looked at the history of land privatization in Latin America, say the second half of the 19th century, in these not very democratic and not very accountable political systems, it's associated more or less everywhere, except maybe in Costa Rica, with enormous increases in land inequality, meaning, you have a lot of indigenous people who had collective title on land, or there was a lot of frontier land that was not very valuable, but then came extremely valuable because of globalization. Suddenly you could grow coffee and you could export it. And so that land all became up for grabs. And then what you see everywhere, the best documented cases are like Guatemala, places in Central America, but it happens in Peru, it happens everywhere in Bolivia, is this enormous sort of land grab and enormous increases in land inequality. So, so one would be anxious that the same sort of thing is going to happen in Africa. You don't have very accountable democratic political systems at a national level. So when you reorganize these property rights, there's huge risks.
Yeah, and I think economists are more and more acknowledging that even the traditional institutions do serve an important role. You mentioned insurance, for example. And so there is a bit of a tension now between, on the one hand, growing awareness of the positives of these traditional land allocation systems, but also, for instance, you mentioned the Udry Goldstein paper on the big distortions that sometimes these more customary systems imply, right? In their work, it's if you are not connected to the chief, you face a high risk of expropriation, and so balancing the pros and the cons of the traditional and the modern system seems to be like a huge challenge. Every time I'm working in Uganda a lot today, and every time I go to Uganda, there are 2 conferences on land issues in every given week. It seems to be really an issue that is at the core of the debate between state, academia, civil society. So something that, from a narrow corridor perspective, I think would be quite interesting to study.
Yeah, I mean, the land is very important in Africa. You know, your ancestors are buried under the land. You know, like if you go to Umachezi, where I'm a chief, for example, there's 4 kindreds, like 4 big extended families, and you go into one of their kind of compounds, and all the parents are buried, the father, the grandfather, maybe there's an ancestral shrine, and so the land has a kind of sort of spiritual and supernatural importance also, of a sort that doesn't exist in Western society, but that also, like you're kind of attached to the land in a kind of deeper sense, in some sense, in many African communities.
Yeah. And at the same time, things like, again, in many regions, things like land markets, both sale markets and rental markets are growing. So there seems to be an interesting balance between, on the one hand, the cultural value that land still holds in these places, but on the other hand, a growing sort of monetization and marketization of this resource. Anyway, let's you mentioned about the legitimacy of chieftaincy institution today as being still very strong, I think, when we were talking about your experience as chief in Nigeria. At the same time, the Afrobarometer, for example, consistently shows that Africans have a very strong support for modern democratic institutions. It's gone down a bit. Maybe that's a bit of a source of concern if you look at the most recent waves of Afrobarometer. Support for democracy has gone down. Justification for some time strong men or strong regimes stepping in to fight corruption has gone up, but overall it remains a strong support for democracy and democratic institutions in many countries. How do you see the coexistence between these type of values and the, again, strong legitimacy or more traditional institutions like the chieftaincy? Do you see them coexisting?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a difference between the sort of local politics and traditional politics and national politics. I mean, the calculation that I have is that at the time of the scramble for Africa, there were probably 45,000 separate polities in Africa. So many of those are very small scale. In Eastern Nigeria, there are probably 500, So I don't know if you want to call those a state, but maybe, they're pretty small, some of them. I mean, Eastern Nigeria, every village is almost autonomous, but that's not the only part of Africa that is like that. Cameroon, southern Cameroon and Gabon, the Fon people, the Beti people are like that. The Shona land in Zimbabwe is like that. You have many places extremely decentralized. So that's all of that very decentralized political geography was kind of aggregated, by colonial powers into these 50 states. So I think there's a real kind of breach between like national politics and like the local politics, or at least the way I interpret that is, of course, there's generally a failure to find an equilibrium between those two levels, because the problem of aggregating all those little social contracts up to the national level is extremely difficult. And in a country like Nigeria, I mean, in Sierra Leone, you could sort of say, okay, they're not so different, like chieftaincy in Temne land or something, or in Mende land, or, you had like some very decentralized societies like the Shurbro in Sierra Leone, but like, it was sort of, and you had the Poro society, secret society, which is actually a kind of national institution, So there was something to play with there. But in Nigeria, the north of Nigeria with these Fulani Emirates, and the Yoruba land, and it's like you have a huge heterogeneity in these different systems. So I think the way I interpret those questions is about the national state, rather than the local state. I mean, I think many of these local state institutions are not democratic. I mean, some of them are. This village where I'm a chief, that's like hyper democratic. But even in Eastern Nigeria, there's places where essentially you have a sort of gerontocracy. Like there's a chief, and the chief is the eldest man. Sometimes the eldest man and the eldest women, like, together. Why the eldest, you might say. Well, I asked that question. And the point is, the eldest are closest to the ancestors, so they're best able to mediate with the ancestors. So there you have a kind of gerontocratic system. You have other systems where there's like real hereditary authority. There's some ruling family or whatever, and there's, Yoruba land has these hereditary monarchies, so you have but I think like those institutions can be legitimate, like if you look at human history, we have a king in England, so humans have, created lots of different sorts of legitimate political institutions. I think it's a bit kind of ahistorical to think that everyone was just waiting around for modern liberal democracy to arrive, and I think that's still true. It took me some time to understand that and kind of come to terms with it personally. But I think that's how it is, So, but the national level, that's a different thing. There's no traditional institutions at the national level, So that's a kind of tabula rasa. Of course, that's been a problem in Africa. But I think, most Africans probably would say, we're okay with gerontocracy here, but we want something accountable that's going to be responsive in some way at the national level. There's no precedent, whatever. So I don't think people are proposing, gerontocracy at the national level. Of course, in the 1960s, there was a lot more discussion of that in Africa. Nkrumah, Nyerere, all these people were talking about different models, but that kind of disappeared basically in Africa, that discussion. Although, many people admire a lot, say, Paul Kagame, or which is a relatively non-democratic system. Depends who you talk to, but I think, at least as far as I can tell, it's not a very democratic system. But they admire the fact that Kagame can get all this stuff done, and because just reflecting the frustrations in post-colonial Africa.
Yeah, and indeed, my sense is that in the Afrobarometers, when it comes to concerns about democracy, it's really about concerns about things like corruption or not getting things done. And in some of these cases, there is legitimacy for a strong man or some type of strong institutions. Also worth to notice that in the post-colonial period, attempts to get rid of these traditional authorities have systematically failed, right, in many countries. And so this coexistence has been lasting and probably it's going to last for quite some time. So you mentioned about the 40,000, 45,000, I lost track. 45,000 different parties. And I think in some of your recent work is about explaining that this is not by accident. This is a result of a maximization program, let's say. Maybe not the one that as a Westerner we think should take place. But tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, I like that calculation. That's in this work that I've done with Soren Hen, one of my collaborators, which is, trying to, what I'm trying to do is sort of kind of reframe the discussion about Africa, so like when you start talking about Africa, it's always about something bad, something going wrong, something that like we have but they lack kind of thing. Yeah. So, but I think, if you look at African history, you can make an argument that, Africans were trying to achieve something different. I don't even know if we were trying to achieve economic development in the Industrial Revolution, or whether it just kind of happened. I don't know whether it was, I'm not sure there's much evidence that it was really planned, but it emerged, but I think like when you look at Africa, of course, you see, well, there was no Industrial Revolution in Africa, and, and Africa was, was not so well, developed technically, technologies, there wasn't the wheel, writing, plow, stuff like that. So but I think like when you look at Africa and you read about Africa, you sort of see, well, actually the one thing that Africans were really concerned about was this keeping power low, at kind of low levels, like meaning avoiding the creation of centralized states. And when you look at how African societies were organized and how African political systems were organized, they were organized to make it extremely difficult to centralize political authority. Many different examples of that. So I think, the way I've come to think about this is, Africans wanted to keep the scale of political society very small. Why was that? Well, because they attributed a lot of importance to these kinship groups, to clan, and they saw centralized political authority as somehow being a danger to those, a kind of threat to these structures that they valued so much. So then they organized politics in such a way as to make it very difficult to concentrate power. So you don't see many kind of states emerging in pre-colonial Africa. And even the ones that you do have a very special form, like, take Rwanda. Rwanda, the traditional state, which is often described as like one of the most powerful pre-colonial states. In some sense it was, but it was organized around kinship. It was called, the way historians refer to it is the Nginya kingdom. So the Nginya was the royal clan, and it was organized around this system of clans. So it really fused lineage structures with state-like structures, and that's true of all the kind of big pre-colonial states. It's true of Asante, it's true of Oyo, it's true of, so the Africans, even when they created states that look very different from Prussia, or the Chinese state or whatever. So I think, but like my point is that, so that leads to this very decentralized political geography, at the time of the scramble for Africa. But my point is that that's what Africans were trying to achieve, Now that may have had lots of costs, it may have made trade very costly, created all sorts of frictions in trading patterns, made it difficult to do things at scale, but of course it left Africa extremely vulnerable, to colonialism and all sorts of, things that couldn't have been anticipated. But in some well-defined sense, that Africans achieved what they were trying to achieve. They were trying to keep the scale of society small. They were trying to stop the emergence of these big states controlling and bossing people around, and they did succeed. It's a bit like the Swiss in some sense. I always think like Switzerland is like the role model for Nigeria. The problem is it took the Swiss, 700 years to construct that, and the Nigerians don't have 700 years.
And when you say that the goal was to prevent centralization, do you think of this as a widely shared goal, or do you think of this as a goal of the elite within these traditional systems?
Well, that's a good question. I think of it as being widely shared, but of course it's also true. Yeah, it's also true that in many cases we can sort of describe these mechanisms, but we don't know where they came from. So you have to interpret them, There's some cases like, if you read Jomo Kenyatta's book, Facing Mount Kenya from the 1930s, he actually sort of tells the story, he tells the kind of constitutional history of the Kikuyu people through oral history. And he claims that the political so the Kikuyu was a very decentralized society based around kind of kinship and these age grades. And he tells the story of like why the Kikuyu society was organized like that. And it comes from a sort of, there was a king historically, and then there was this popular overthrow of the king, and then there was this sort of constitutional moment where they decide to reorganize the society in such a way as a king will never be able to emerge. So there he tells a sort of story of almost like a, constitutional, that tells that, he tells a very popular story of this reconfiguration of Kikuyu society. So, I'm not an expert on the oral history of the Kikuyu, but like if you read other books about Kikuyu history, that seems to be the sort of consensus, like best guess, it seems to be widely accepted, that interpretation of the oral history. So in some cases we do know it was popular. And I think, the form this takes is different in different parts of Africa, but I think you see this same kind of mechanism everywhere, actually, interestingly enough. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Very, very interesting. So you mentioned that this idea of trying to understand, let's say, what Africans were trying to maximize is part of a maybe broader journey about, as a scholar of Africa, trying to maybe making a strong effort to understand sort of the system from the perspective of the people that we are studying, not just with our lens as Western scholars. And if I understand correctly, I think you mentioned somewhere that when you moved to Chicago at some point, you hit a bit of a reset button and started thinking much more seriously about this. Can you tell us a bit more about this specific journey?
Yeah, that's a long journey. That started when I first started doing field work in Africa, in Botswana, 27 years ago, because I was having lunch with Danny Roderick actually at the Kennedy School. And then somehow this issue, at that time, Botswana was the fastest growing economy in the world for the previous 30 years. So it just, faster than China, faster than South Korea, faster than Singapore, So at lunch, Danny Roderick asked me, like, what the heck is, about Africa? What the heck is, I'd be reading books, whatever, like, what the heck is going on in Botswana? Because I had absolutely no idea. So I was teaching at University of Southern California at the time. So I went to the library. I basically took out every single book I could find on Botswana and sat in my office like for a week reading all these books. And I was like, okay, there's no serious explanation here, But somebody, it was mostly like they had good policies, okay, which is true, but I wanted to dig behind that. So, okay, fine. So I'll go to Botswana. So then, I sort of figured out like some people at the university or somebody working at the central bank who'd been writing about institutions and stuff. So then, I found their email. I went to Gaborone and started talking to people. And it was fantastic. It was fantastic fun. And then also like there in Botswana, once you get to the historians or you get to the anthropologists or you get to the political scientists, I was still an economist in those days, then you start getting a story. And the story was about, the success was, okay, Botswana there were these Swana kind of polities, let's say, which had similar political institutions. They were politically independent, but they spoke the same language. They had similar political institutions. They had history kind of in common, and they were able to kind of do what Nigeria has now been able to do, which is take these traditional institutions and recreate them in the kind of post-colonial state in some sense. In particular, it's Hotla, this kind of tribal assembly, they were able to sort of reinvent that as an institution of accountability in the post-colonial state. So sort of mapping this like local sort of order, up to the national state. So they solved that problem, So that, that taught me lots of things. Like, first of all, it taught me, like, how do you learn about that stuff? It's all in anthropology literature, So I started reading all this anthropology literature. So that made me realize, like, okay, like, you'd never understand what was going on in Botswana unless you kind of came to terms with the traditional African society and how things worked and things like that. So then I started kind of voraciously reading all this social and political anthropology of Africa. And it just, that was really sort of life-changing for me working in Botswana, because it just made me sort of think I didn't know anything, basically. Mm-hmm. Like, I didn't know anything. I didn't know enough about the history. I didn't know enough about the culture. I didn't know enough about the, and you could sit in your office and sort of read things, but it's only when you get there and talk to people, you just get things in perspective. That's my experience. I find it really hard to know, okay, there's this argument, there's that argument, there's this. When you go there and you start talking to people, you just get a much better sense of like what's important and what's not important. It's really hard to do that in your office, in my experience. So I think that set me off on a completely different direction, and I sort of taken the spirit of that, everywhere I've been, in Sierra Leone, in Congo, working in Congo for 15 years, in Nigeria, everywhere, I tried to kind of engage with the society and try to look at it. Of course, you don't speak these I don't speak these African languages, and it's a very imperfect, it's a very imperfect exercise, but I think anyone, even anthropologists, would say, of course, it's extremely imperfect, and but my own experience is just, if you make the effort and you learn a lot, and it really changes the way that you understand things. Yeah,
and I think for good, the importance of this point is more and more acknowledged among a broad set of social scientists, including economists. I mean, in the with the, let's say, the field development economics over the last few decades, it's now quite the standard that you spend time in the field. Maybe you live in a place for a year or more before doing a PhD or doing your PhD. So I think that even comparing to, again, maybe 20 years ago, this idea that you have to spend time on the field and talking to people and getting a deep understanding of the local context and institutions is much stronger. In my own experience, I think the anecdote that I always remember is we were working with dairy farmers in Kenya who were selling milk every day. Okay, and they actually like to be paid not whenever they sell milk, but only once, let's say, at the end of the month. Okay, and from a basic econ perspective, this is crazy. We think I want money now, I want to invest, but they're actually willing to take a lower price for a buyer that could pay at the end of the month than for somebody who could pay every day. So we come with our ideas. We were talking to some of these buyers, and we said actually what you should be doing if you want to be more competitive is to pay more frequently, to pay your dairy farmers from whom you are buying milk, not just once a month, but every day. And the guy looks at us and says, no, look, you don't understand what you're talking about. These farmers value that they can trust me to hold their money until the end of the month, so that then when I pay them not $1 every day, but I don't know, $30 or whatever at the end of the month, they can do something meaningful with this. And so for me, this is the quintessential example in which the ideas that sometimes we come up from our classrooms, our books, have to be filtered and confronted with reality in the field, especially before you design a program, you implement an intervention which can have consequences on real life. So I think at all the levels, try to understand institutions and maybe more high-level policy, but also micro-level. This is a super important point.
Yeah, and I think it's made me sort of understand something which I never understood, when I was a student or kind of a young professor, which is that so much social theory is sort of, it's like generalizations from the history of Western society, sort of projected into the rest of the world as if it was some universal theory. Like Marxism is the sort of the best idea, best example. Like Marx, looked out of his window and he saw like bourgeoisie and proletariat and all of this, whatever. And then he kind of comes up with this general theory of human society and says, well, that applies in Africa too, and it applies in India and things like that. So you completely flatten out all these kind of cultural and historical differences. And I think, in the world we're living in at the moment, where you have the rise of China, where, in some sense you start thinking, well, it's not just we looked at the Western Europe, we looked at it over this 200-year period, but if we think about thousands of years, it's just a little 200 years in thousands of years, and then maybe things are reorganizing themselves in a different way and different fundamentals become, there's other potential in society that we haven't seen by just kind of looking at it at this one lens. So I think that's a very exciting. That's kind of where that thought has led me also.
But let me push a bit on this, because on the one hand, I think we all agree that we don't want to propose a theory straight that works for the entire world. But then others will say, you can't have a theory of Africa. Because, Africa is a million different things. Africa is not a country, as the says. Yeah. How does one find the balance between some need for theories and principles, but the risk of simplification and generalization? How do you try to achieve this balance in your work?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think the discussion of Africa, I think my own view is that, Africa is terribly diverse and complicated, but so is Europe. Europe has like Norway and Albania in it, for example. Like the difference between Norway and Albania, might be larger than between any two African society, but we still find it useful to talk about Europe. And I think, what I try to make the argument is that over large parts of Africa, probably because of the Bantu expansion, but it's not exactly that, but you see common religious ideas, you see common supernatural ideas, you see common social institutions, and so I think there's enough there that makes it kind of okay or useful to talk about Africa. I think we're social scientists, so social science is all about that balance you're talking about. I remember I like telling this story, but when I was an undergraduate at the LSE studying economics, and I came home for Christmas once. And my mother never went to university. She was a teacher. She went to teacher training college. And then she starts asking me about, so what have you been learning, what have you been learning? And I come out with some, I don't remember what I talked about, something. And I finished by saying something, it's all very complicated, Mum. And she looked at me and said, isn't it obvious that it's complicated? I mean, I never studied economics, but for me, it's obviously complicated. So why you're studying economics at the London School of Economics, and what you've learned is it's complicated. Like, isn't it your job to say, actually, it's much simpler than you thought it was? And she was totally right, you know. So I learned that. I learned my lesson. I think our job is, you know, social scientists. You know, we don't have the same skill set as anthropologists or historians, or, you know, like we have. But we're good at generalizing. You know, trying to see the common, you know, the commonalities within all of this complexity, you know, and I think that's useful, you know, that's very useful. I find it, but it's difficult, you know, we're always worried about the exceptions and things that don't fit, and you know, I've done a lot of this, you know. Why Nations Fail, of course, is a sort of example of like staggering kind of, you know, oversimplification. But I also see how incredibly useful that is. I mean, I've probably given like, you know, 500 talks about why nations fail in the last 15 years. And you see, you talk to these, you know, you just talk to ordinary people, or you talk in a bookshop, or you talk to like business people, or at some non-academic conference. And you know, people want simple ideas to help them understand the world. The world is really complicated. And you know, how do I, so I think that's an important role for us. I think like it's difficult. It's difficult, but I think it's very useful socially, and I think it's important, and I think social scientists are the people who can do that, you know, and everybody shouldn't be doing it, but some people should be doing it. But where you draw the line, I don't know. I'm always struggling with that and agonizing about it. Yeah, very difficult.
Very good, very good. I agree, it's not easy. So let's go back then to your journey. So one big idea that you come up now is indeed that the plurality of African polities was, you know, the result of a specific maximization problem. Another concept I think you have been pushing on recently is this idea of wealth in people, as opposed to wealth in asset or in money.
Yeah.
So
well, I'm trying to find a language to talk about like what's different about Africa, but not like something which is like bad, or like something missing, or something, you know, to have a more sort of constructive discussion. And you know, you've worked in Africa, you know, like you realize when you work in Africa, you know, I remember like when I started working in Sierra Leone, for example, I hired this chap who I was still very good friends with him. You know, he runs this NGO in Freetown now. I hired this chap to like work to get some stuff for me in the National Archive. And then, you know, I discovered that he wasn't doing it. But he'd outsourced it, you know, to his cousins from Bo. And his cousins from Bo had come, they were staying in his house, and they were doing the work in the archive. And I said to him, Andrew, like, I thought you were I asked you to do that. And he said, I am doing it, you know. And then, no, your cousin's doing it, you know. Like, so, you know, everyone is sort of embedded in these networks of kind of obligation and reciprocity and commitment, and like just the density of social life is incredible. Like, you know, where I'm a chief in Umuchezi, you know, when I come with my friend, you know, Chima, you know, like he has a house there. I mean, he's a professor at Marquette University in Milwaukee, but, you know, we come, you go to, you know, and everyone is there, like everyone is in his house the whole time, you know, like he's doing, you know, it's just like the density of social life is just, and it affects everything. It affects, you know, economics, it affects politics, it affects... So I think this phrase, which was coined by anthropologists in the 1970s, like wealth in people, is meant to capture the sort of enormous centrality of these social relations in African society. And I think that helps explain lots of things. It helps explain why do you care so much about kinship and clan, and why are you so worried about states disrupting this kind of society. You know, it explains, you know, why do you hold property rights to land in the way you do? Because it helps keep the people together, you know. Like, I think many things, like how, you know, like the way labor markets historically worked in Africa, you know, you mobilize your people to work in the farm, you know. So I think many things you can, like, at least when I started seeing things through that lens, then you start understanding why lots of institutions were organized the way they were.
And so this wealth in people, you're saying, is not a mean towards some other goal. It's really the goal, or one of the goals in itself.
I think it becomes the goal. I mean, you know, you can think of it as sort of I mean, it's certainly a way of achieving stuff, but I guess the way I've come to think about that is often it's designed to sort of reinforce this principle in some sense. Many institutions are. So you attach enormous value to that. That's just my personal experience of, working there. And of course, that's, that sounds like a great principle, actually, like why not? And it's, captured in enormous numbers of proverbs, for example, and stories and literature. It's actually better described in literature than it is kind of, social scientifically or even by historians or whatever. There's some, Sarah Berry, there's some anthropologist, Jane Geyer, who've kind of written about this, and they have sort of ethnographic examples, Polly Hill, but the best descriptions of it are more or less, basically in literature. I find that principle, like, again, it's sort of simplification. We're trying to find some principle that helps us sort of unify a lot of different phenomena. I guess that's the spirit in which I talk about it. Mm-hmm. But it's also, it's a kind of nice thing, like I realized, you alluded to the fact that when I moved from Harvard, I threw away all my lecture notes. I deleted the folder from my hard drive because it was and I started again, and part of that was, I used to teach with Robert Bates, and Bob was an amazing inspiration to me, but he'd stand up and just endlessly talk about all these terrible things that went on in Africa. And then I'd go to Africa and I'd be just like happy, I'm in Nigeria now, I'm happy, and I thought how does that, why is it, why am I happy? And I tried to sort of introspect about what was it I liked about Africa, and then I realized this is one of the things that's so amazing. This kind of density of social life is just, one of the things that I really liked, and I liked seeing my friends, and, so then I started from that and kind of worked up, in my reconstruction.
Yeah, and of course, one, let's say, potential negative view on this is to say that there is my people and the others, right? And so there are, of course, phenomena in which these wealthy people constrains, to some extent, efficiency. For example, in some of our work on land markets, going back to land, we find that when we give incentives to trade in land, this trade occurs within a pretty narrow set of people, or relatively narrow set of people, which of course reduces overall efficiency gains compared to a more decentralized market. So that would be one view to say. But then I also understand that from some of your recent work and from other recent surveys that at the same time, this importance of clan and kinship coexist with an openness to, at least in certain sectors, to strangers.
I'm skeptical about that view. So let me tell you about, not my own evidence, but Ben Enke's evidence. Ben has this extremely interesting paper in the American Economic Review about moral universalism. So he has this very nice kind of simple way of measuring, to what extent do I favor somebody kind of close to me, like in my family or whatever, or as opposed to somebody kind of more socially distant. And so somebody who's morally universal is someone who, you don't discriminate against someone socially close, So in his survey, who are the most morally universalistic people in the world? Nigerians, Ethiopians, Zambians. It's absolutely striking. Now, I think we kind of knew that already because there's this work in Uganda many years ago by James Habyarimana, McCartan Humphreys, Dan Posner, this co-ethnicity book. It basically finds the same thing, at least in an anonymous interaction, I don't prefer my own ethnicity. I just kind of I treat everybody equally. And maybe I prefer my own ethnicity when they can see that I'm making these decisions, So I think, there's other evidence, but I found that really exciting. Yeah.
And it's interesting how this coexists, for instance, with all the issues we know about trust in some of these societies from the work on Leonard and Nathan Nunn, right? So it seems that on the one hand, you can have openness to strangers and coexisting with some of these trust barriers, for example.
So, but my view on trust is that, trust is a very complicated equilibrium phenomenon that depends on institutions, on the legal institutions and whatever, So I think, if you ask me, do I trust you? That doesn't just depend on some intrinsic property of our social relationship. It depends on, so I find it kind of a bit complicated, this issue of trust. I understand exactly what you're saying. That's beautiful. It's a brilliant piece of research, about the legacy of the slave trade for kind of social capital. And I do think there are puzzles there, actually, in the Afrobarometer in terms of trust? Who do you trust? Like this, I think there's puzzles, about the nature of the answers in Africa for sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think you also did some research, let's say so, on the linguistic implications of this openness to strangers.
Yeah, so that's something very striking, that I which is, was pointed out by this historian to me that, and then we just looked at this much more systematically. So it turns out that in most African languages, the word for guest and stranger are the same, So, and I, the way I think about that is, go back to thinking about wealth in people, people are valuable, and you're always trying to kind of expand your social network. I mean, the greatest example, actually going back to Botswana, is that, if you look at the last census in Botswana from 1946, where they actually tabulated all these different kind of identities, then they stopped doing it. But and you look at like the Ngwato land. So the Ngwato was like one of these kind of pre-colonial Swana polities. Mm-hmm. And you look at like who was living in the Ngwato kind of reserve in 1946. Only 20% of the population were actually Ngwato. It's like 20%. And you look at the list of people, there's people from all over Southern Africa there. So people are moving around, people are being incorporated, people from South Africa and Namibia and Angola and Zimbabwe. And, so I think that's the bigger sort of picture. Like historically in Africa, people are moving around, they're being incorporated, people are valuable, So the way I think about this guest stranger, it's just a sort of innovation to help incorporate people. Now, of course, when colonialism comes, colonialism stops all that moving about. And colonialism sort of, changes people's incentives in some way. And it changes, there's kind of stereotypes, on the basis of colonial powers, but also it changes African incentives, because, so I think, for me, a lot of this ethnicity, ethnicity is a real thing, as you know, in Africa. It's a real thing. So I don't want to deny that ethnicity exists, but I think people have many identities. Let's, go back to Eastern Nigeria. Like if you go to Umuchese, for example, like my friend, like what I noticed with him is like, if you're in the village, there's 4 kinship groups and your identity is like your kinship group, okay? But there's a bigger area, the local government authority, which is called Mbaise, which is like named after a clan. So if you're in Mbaise, then your identity is the village. If you're in Owerri, the city, your identity is Mbaise, from the Mbaise clan. But, if I'm in the University of Nigeria, then I'm from Imo State. So it's real segmentary. It's like, your identity is different depending on the context and depending on who you're interacting with. And I think and if you're in Lagos, maybe you're Igbo, and if you're in Zurich, you're Nigerian, whatever. So I think we all have sort of multiple identities. One of those is, sure, it's an ethnic identity, but I think there's lots of other identities.
And as you say, these are malleable. I think there is research showing that even in a given context, which identity we refer to varies with context, with policy, with economic situation, etc. So I must say, speaking of Western filters, I used to live in Kenya for a couple of years, so I got to speak Swahili reasonably well. And that's one language in which mgeni, right, it's strange and guest. Of course, as a Western, I never observed that as a deep thing. So
we're not the first people who noticed that, but I think we're the first people who looked at it more systematically. It's a pretty cool fact.
It's Africa and Hawaii, right?
Exactly. So that, yes, I didn't say. So what you're pointing out is that Africa is the only part of the world where this is true. I mean, I'm not in the business of looking for like the X factor that makes Africa sort of unique, because I think like wealth in people, every society has that to a bit, like we're all, humans all, we all come from Africa and we spread out over the world, Homo sapiens 70,000 years ago. And so I don't want to say, we created very different societies in different parts of the globe and whatever, but I don't want to say Africans are like totally different or whatever, because that's not true, and I think, but I do want to kind of find a parsimonious way of sort of describing like why, and how Africa kind of diverged historically and what does it mean for the future, and I think these principles are all kind of interesting because they're kind of positive things, in the world we're living in at the moment, and that's also my agenda,
Excellent. So James, we have a few minutes left, so I want to touch on another topic before finishing, which is the expansion or the need to expand representation of scholars in our profession from African countries, from other emerging economies. And I know you have been very active on this in Colombia, in Nigeria, or to some extent.
Yeah.
So what's your view on that? What's the goal? What should we try to achieve? How could we improve on this?
Yeah, no, I taught in Bogota for 28 years every summer. I taught a summer school every year for 28 years in Bogota. And then, we've been teaching, I was teaching with this AERC in Nairobi, which unfortunately...
The African Economic Research Consortium.
The African Economic Research Consortium. But unfortunately, that's basically collapsed now because the Swedish and British government took the funding away. So there they had this collaborative PhD program with all these African universities. It's basically been shut down this year. So now I'm restarting something else next summer in NCA in Abidjan, which is this fantastic statistical institute. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's a really amazing place. So now we're trying to start something new, a summer school every summer in NCA in Abidjan. We're just getting that going at the moment. So
So this is targeting, let's say, PhD students there? Yeah.
PhD students, junior scholars, but my agenda, which is not everyone's agenda, is trying to make the African scholars kind of embrace, studying Africa, and just think about, because that's what, I think what I find with African students is they feel they want to be like Western scholars. They don't want to write about Africa. They should be writing about Germany, or Switzerland or something. And of course, they should do whatever they like, like you want to train intellectuals and but let's start. African scholars have so much to offer, because they understand their societies in a way we can't possibly do, So I think a good place is let's start by, working with them to help us, get them to help us understand Africa better and how things work in Africa. And so, so I try to encourage, we try to encourage very much this sort of appreciation of Africa. I remember when I was teaching in Nairobi, we had this wonderful student. She was a Maasai lady from Western Kenya. And after 1 week, she said to me, "Are you telling me that Maasai society, traditional Maasai society, was not backward?" And I said, no, it was not backward. It was perfectly logical. It just was not organized like West. And this was devastating for her. And I said, where did you learn that? She said, at school in Kenya.
Yeah.
So that's what you're fighting against in some sense. There's still people just have this negative view of African society and African institutions. And so I think that's very much my agenda. That's not everyone's agenda, and there's different agendas. And, but my experience in Bogota, was that was just life-changing for me. It's one of the most fulfilling things I've ever done as an academic. When I started teaching there was one person on the faculty at the University of the Andes with a PhD, in economics. So I kind of came, and no one was teaching modern political economy or modern development or anything like that. The students were fantastic, So the students get it immediately, So I'd have all these amazing students, in the class, and it was just fantastic experience, And I quit doing that because the department's totally changed now. Everyone is just full of really great young scholars,
people,
and so they don't need me anymore.
And of course, one important point is training, getting appropriate training at the right time, at the right stage. The other, at least in many African countries, is the structure of universities, the set of incentives for the academic career, the remuneration.
Yeah.
Of course, there are some excellent places. Of course, we are familiar with the African School of Economics, among others. But it's still the case that to do an academic career, let's say in Uganda or Kenya, it's very difficult if you don't do a lot of outside activities.
Exactly. So I think one thing that's very important is, the way, again, there's different objectives, but the point here is of course, if you can identify some African who's going to go to Harvard and, and be a brilliant, great, but you have to understand, you're not teaching to that one person, we want to place people in the University of Yaoundé, or the University of wherever it is in Africa. In fact, that's what you desperately need, because You want African students to be exposed to this wherever they are in the continent, at university. And so I don't think this is just about identifying the really smart people. And you know, it's also about spreading this more generally. And yeah, you have to understand people's incentives, absolutely. Yeah, and what works for them. And of course, for many people, you know, the incentive to do something very conventional is, gosh, they would love a job at the World Bank, for example. And you know, who could blame them? You know, I'm all in favour of that too. You know, so I think there's multiple objectives, and you're right that you have to be sensitive to that. Yeah.
But based on your experience in the last few years, would you say you are reasonably optimistic about?
You know, well, I always say, like in Colombia, I never noticed. It took a decade before I actually realized I was having an impact. You know,
okay.
So it's a very, you know, like, and then after 20 years, you know, 15 years, like it was great. It was great. You know, so I think it's early days. You know, I think with the AERC there was a lot of problems with like the philosophy of the AERC, like from my own personal perspective. There were a lot of very well-intentioned people involved, but like for me, you know, I was very unhappy with a lot of the way things were done, you know. So I'm, you know, so I think from my own perspective, again, there's different perspectives, but from my own perspective, you know, we're starting again.
Yeah. And you mentioned,
ask me in 10 years' time.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, looking forward to it. And you mentioned impact. Of course, another way to have impact is not just on students or academic or on academic staff, but on, for instance, policymakers. I worked with very qualified staff at the Ministry of Lands in Uganda. I used to work with the Revenue Authority in Kenya. And there I feel that it's very different, but just convey, for example, the importance of, you know, good data analysis, good evidence. It's something that can you know, have an impact on how policies are implemented. Again, in this work, for instance, with the Ministry of Lands in Uganda, you know, they put together this very impressive database on land records, land registry. But the big question is how then to use this data to inform policy. And that's where I think with our type of expertise, we can sort of contribute and have a different form of impact, I guess, with your work, with other collaborations. You must have experienced similar dynamics.
Yeah, I'm not a person who's that. I've never been that involved in the policy world, you know, because I think my view of social science is too complicated, you know, like.
But you're trying to simplifying, right?
It's simplification, but simplification doesn't necessarily lead to policy conclusions, you know, because like for example, this language of extractive and, you know, inclusive institutions is meant to be a kind of very simple generalization that allows you to see what's common in many societies. But of course, you know, if you go to one country and say, okay, so how do we make extractive institutions more inclusive? Then all the details instantly become critical to that, you know, because how you do that in Colombia is completely different from how you do it in Zimbabwe or Uzbekistan, you know. So you can't just pull this lever and press that button and everything will be fine. That kind of, you know, Jeffrey Sachs approach to policy advice, I think it's just foolish, you know. I think like then you have to decide in life, you know, in your career, which way do you want to go? Do you want to go in that direction and take that seriously and commit yourself to that? But I guess I've always just been much more like an academic, you know, just interested in these kind of intellectual questions and like, you know, and that's what I get most excited about.
And we are happy you went through this path.
So, you know, I'm still sort of in that space, unfortunately. Yeah.
Or fortunately. James, thank you very much. It's been amazing. It's been a great pleasure.
All right.